Hey guys, this is Corey Klein, and today I'm going to give you a brief overview of my comparative investigation titled School Bullying and Violence, a Threat to Equity in Education. So as you know, we're going to be looking at UNESCO's Sustainable Development Targets as a base for this research paper. So I'm going to be looking at the essential concept of peace. Originally, I had it set for place, but I had a difficult time finding information that was specific to urban environments. And also, there's a huge difference in the amount of population in Korea that lives in urban environments versus the amount of the population in the Philippines that does. So I decided to change my essential concept to peace. I'm going to be looking at target 4.5, which has to do with equity, because school violence, bullying, and any sort of discriminatory practice in schools is a direct threat to equity in education. And for the implementation target, I'm going to be looking at education facilities and learning environments. There will be a little bit of crossover between, the role of quality teachers, because teachers and the administration are a core part of creating these education facilities and learning environments that are healthy and safe for their students. For this comparative investigation, I'm going to be looking at Korea and the Philippines. So I have some research questions for this, and for the final paper, these might change a little bit, but I'm going to ask, what does the research literature say about the effectiveness of quality facilities and learning environments and the prevalence of bullying and school violence among vulnerable student populations in schools? So I'm going to be looking at if certain demographics are particularly susceptible, if the same factors apply between the two countries. I'm going to be looking at some prevention programs and policies that are meant to mitigate violence or school bullying and see, how effective they are. And I'm going to be looking at the role of the administration and faculty for the creation of a safe, supportive, and equal school climate. So for purposes of comparison, because this is an investigative study, I'm going to be using Bray and Thomas's framework for comparative education analysis, which you can, to the right, see the cube of the different dimensions. And so I am going to be sticking with 3 dimensions for this comparative study. I'm going to be looking at geographic and locational levels, level 2. So I'm going to be looking at 2 countries, Korea and the Philippines. I'm going to be looking at aspects of education and society, which falls under the other aspects portion, which is bullying and school violence prevention programs and interventions. And I'm going to be looking at specific age groups, which is students in primary and secondary school. I would have liked to limit the age group specifically to primary school age or secondary school age, but I already had a difficult time finding specific studies that had to do with everything I'm trying to research in that stuck to just primary or just secondary. And so maybe in future research, I would like to separate them. But for the purposes of this paper, I'm kind of looking at both primary and secondary. So I'm going to quickly go through some brief country comparisons and the status of the SDG targets in relation to bullying and school violence. So Korea is reported as having positive equity indicators, and their student enrollment among males and females is pretty much equal, and they have almost universal rates of enrollment among primary school, secondary school, and very high rates in higher education as well. In terms of bullying and school violence, Korea is reported in 2018 as having 9.4% of students reported being bullied, which is well below the OECD average of about 22%. According to the same report, boys are more bullied than girls, which is also found in the Philippines, and it seems to be a trend among most countries in the world from studies that I've read. Not just that boys are more bullied than girls, but they also take part in bullying more frequently than girls do. One of the things that was specific to Korea is that lower achieving students are more commonly bullied than their higher achieving counterparts. And one interesting thing about Korea is that the population here is vast majority is ethnically Korean, which kind of, automatically reduces the amount of bullying, violence, and discrimination that has to do with race or culture automatically. However, the amount of Immigrants and multicultural families here in Korea is on the rise. So a 2016 report from OECD said that this could be a possible challenge for school systems in the future. So on the other side is the Philippines, which in a lot of ways is doing really well in education compared to other countries in the region. Uh, One thing that was specific to the Philippines is that their female students score higher across the board on the Human Capital Index. So their female students are staying in school longer, they have higher enrollment rates, they get higher test scores. So that was one interesting thing, that it's almost like a reverse disparity in education there currently. Uh, the Philippines has reported almost a 65% rate of students being bullied, which is the highest recorded in this OECD report. They also found that boys are more bullied than girls. Disadvantaged students are more likely to be bullied, so students that come from lower socioeconomic status. Immigrant students are more likely to be bullied, which is different than Korea, where there's not enough reporting of it to really discuss. But here in the Philippines, it is like a major issue. And one thing that is common in the Philippines, or at least more prevalent than in Korea, is just overall violence towards students, whether it's like on their way to school or some other violence in the community that's not present in Korea. So even though Korea's bullying rates are much lower than in the Philippines, it's still seen as a major problem. And so I looked at a few studies that looked at kind of the occurrence of bullying and who it's affecting, and also policies or programs meant to prevent it. And there are programs that are in place, and a lot of them that I've found have to do with the development of character that's been kind of incorporated into their curriculum. However, some of the critique that I found of these studies and some of the data that is in these studies found that Korean programs in this department are too focused on the individual, and looking at the characteristics of the person who's bullying, or the characteristics of the person who's being bullied, rather than incorporating like a larger view of their relationship with like their parents, or kind of the cultural aspects of it. And so there were recommendations for future programs in Korea to look more at these relationships. But one of the things that it found was that teachers need to be more involved in creating like a healthy school environment, and they sometimes are even the cause of occurrences of bullying because of their non-involvement or their non-monitoring practices, or lots of things in that matter. So in the report, I'm going to be writing more about that. So looking at the Philippines now, which again, I said the rates of bullying are much higher. One problem they have is that violence in some of the regions in the Philippines is damaging their school facilities and reducing quality teachers, which is an important thing to keep in mind. The Philippine Department of Education enacted this order number 40S 2012, which was their kind of flagship policy for addressing school violence, discrimination, and bullying against students. It was kind of a zero tolerance policy that set clear roles for all parties involved. It did a little bit better than Korea in looking at relationships with teachers, looking at relationships between students and parents, looking at other cultural aspects. However, some critique of this program or policy that I found that they were using too many of their resources to deal with individual cases with bullying, rather than setting up more preventative measures in the first place. There was not enough government funding. The funding for this program was often at odds with other funding for education things, like getting more tables and chairs and things like that. And similar to the Korean policies, they also said that there needs to be more teacher involvement and character curricula development for addressing these kind of problems. So if I were to conduct my own study or to research this further, one, I would want access to more information. I feel like a lot of the reports that I was looking for are only in Korean or not in English, and so that really limited the amount of information that I was able to find. I would really like to narrow the research more, and so if I was conducting my own investigation or own evaluation, I would limit it to specific environments. I would look at more specific age groups. So only primary, only secondary, or maybe I would only look at, Form 4 in each of the countries. And so the methods I would use for that, I would, one, collect and compare more recent data. A lot of the data that I found was either from like 2013, 2014. And so I would like, data in the last like 3 or 4 years. I would also look at more specific data. I found a lot of the information I was able to find was quite broad, but I would like to find, really specific information. And if I were conducting an investigate comparison or my own sort of evaluation, I would set up an identical policy in a specific school, and I would record the effect of that policy over the course of one school year. All right, and lastly, here's my references page. Thank you guys so much.